This is a bomber over the English countryside in 1943. Its wings stretch wide, glittering silver in the morning haze. Down below, the airfields of East Anglia hum with motion. Jeeps, bicycles, mechanics, crews drinking coffee from tin cups, ground crews shouting over roaring engines. And above all that noise, there's one unmistakable sound. The steady, rising thunder of 4 Wright Cyclone engines warming up for another run into the heart of Germany. This is the flying fortress, the B-17. To the Americans who built it, it was more than a bomber. It was an idea, a promise, the belief that technology and courage together could win a war at 20,000 feet. They called it a fortress because it carried more guns than any aircraft before it, up to 13 Browning 50 calibers bristling from every direction. Front, rear, sides, belly, top, no blind spots, no mercy. At least, that was the theory. But the men who climbed inside these planes every morning knew the truth. The sky above Europe wasn't theirs. It belonged to the Luftwaffe. When the first B-17s arrived in England in 1942, they looked unstoppable. Huge, rugged, and capable of flying home on 3, even 2 engines. Propaganda reels called them invincible fortresses of freedom. Newspapers back in the States ran pictures of crews smiling beside their planes with names painted on the noses. Memphis Belle, Hell's Angel, Bit O'Lace. Young men, 20, 21 years old, standing proud before the camera, believing they were part of something unbreakable. And for a moment, it seemed true. Their first missions, over France, over occupied Holland, went surprisingly well. Light flak, few interceptors. The crews came home with bullet holes in the wings, but smiles on their faces. They sang songs in the mess, scribbled letters home, and believed that maybe, just maybe, this war could be won from the air. But then came 1943. By now, the Luftwaffe had learned. They no longer chased bombers one by one like dueling knights. They attacked in swarms, in perfect coordination. They learned where the fortress was weakest, the formation edges, the tails, the blind spots below. And they had something new, something faster, heavier, and deadlier than anything before. But that part of the story comes later. For now, picture the sky over Bremen, August 1943. Hundreds of B-17s in tight formation, wings nearly touching, sunlight flashing off aluminum skins. The smell of oil and sweat in the cockpit, the endless drone of engines vibrating through every rib of the plane. In the nose, a bombardier squints through his Norden sight, murmuring coordinates. Behind him, the navigator traces lines on a map, pencil trembling slightly as the aircraft shudders from flak bursts outside. "Flak at 2 o'clock low!" someone yells through the intercom. Black puffs bloom below, then closer. The sky shakes. The pilot keeps formation. He can't break away. That would mean death. One bomber alone is a sitting duck. The formation is survival. The fortress's armor made not of steel, but of numbers. The first fighters appear. Small black dots rising fast, head on. The gunners tense. Bandits 12 o'clock high. The waist gunners grip their twin 50s. The top turret rotates, following the shape streaking closer. Then white flashes. Tracers rip the air. The bombers fire back, 1,000 guns spitting flame. The formation becomes a storm of light, noise, and smoke. After the attack, silence. The pilot glances to his right, where another B-17 should be. There's nothing but drifting smoke, and a few falling pieces of metal glinting in the sun. That was the first time many crews realized the fortress could die. Still, the legend grew. Newspapers back home told stories of crippled bombers limping home on one engine, crews surviving incredible odds. Some of it was true. The B-17 was tough, sometimes unbelievably so. There were tales of planes landing with entire sections of fuselage missing, with wings shredded and rudders half gone. One crew came back with the tail nearly shot off, held together only by control cables. When they landed, the whole tail collapsed onto the runway like a broken toy. These stories kept morale alive. But for every bomber that made it home, another didn't. Each new raid meant losses, 10 planes, 20, sometimes 60. And every plane carried 10 men. The math was merciless. The air war over Europe was becoming a grinder, and the flying fortress was right in its teeth. Back in the States, new crews were training daily, learning to load bombs, man turrets, read maps. They learned to fly in tight box formations and to trust the man next to them with their life. They learned to believe in the fortress, but no amount of training could prepare them for what was waiting in the skies of Germany. By mid-1943, the Germans had shifted tactics. Their fighters no longer simply strafed the bombers with rifle-caliber guns. They came armed with something heavier. First, the 20mm MG-151, powerful enough to tear through armor plating. Then, the 30mm cannon, a weapon so devastating that a single hit could shear a bomber in half. The crews didn't know this yet. To them, each raid was just another line on the board. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, Hamburg. One city after another, each deeper inside enemy territory, each more deadly than the last. But the tone was changing. The laughter in the mess halls was quieter now. Letters home became shorter, more careful. No one wanted to admit how scared they were. The veterans stopped painting fresh nose art on new planes. There wasn't time, and too many new names had to be added to the memorial boards. Still, the fortresses flew. They had to. A typical mission began before dawn. Crews dressed in layers of wool and leather, then oxygen masks, flak vests, heavy boots. Temperatures at altitude could drop to -40 degrees. Frostbite was as much an enemy as any German fighter. Inside, the plane was a maze of metal and noise. The intercom crackled constantly. Check oxygen. Left engine oil pressure low. Formation turning to heading 090. The pilot's hand shook, not from fear, but from the vibration of the throttles. The waist gunners stood by their guns, eyes searching the sky. And then, the first explosions. The flak was invisible until it wasn't. Black blossoms of smoke appeared ahead, drifting lazily, until you realized each one carried hundreds of razor fragments, spinning at supersonic speed. You couldn't dodge them. You could only fly straight through. One burst close enough to pepper the fuselage with holes. You could hear the shrapnel clanging through the metal like hail. Somewhere behind, someone screamed. The intercom hissed with static, then went dead. The smell of burning insulation filled the nose compartment, but they kept going. Because that was the rule. You never turned back alone. When they finally reached the target, the bombardier took over. Bomb bay doors open. Cold wind screamed through the fuselage. The plane rose lighter as the bombs fell, a faint whistle fading into silence below. And then came the part everyone dreaded, the turn for home. That's when the fighters came hardest, diving out of the sun, firing cannon shells that exploded on impact. Some B-17s made it back with holes big enough to crawl through. Others vanished in fireballs. And from the ground, people watching would see tiny dots tumbling from the sky, parachutes opening, sometimes not. That was the price of daylight bombing. It was supposed to be precise, humane. Industrial warfare, the generals called it. Destroy the enemy's factories, not his cities. But from 20,000 feet, there was no such thing as precision. Smoke, clouds, flak bursts, and the constant, suffocating terror that every minute could be your last. Yet the fortresses kept flying. Every day, new crews arrived, believing in the myth that the flying fortress could take anything the Germans threw at it. They didn't yet know that the Luftwaffe was preparing something that would change everything, a weapon designed to make even the toughest bomber seem fragile. But that's a story for the next chapter. When the 30mm cannon enters the war, and the sky above Germany turns into a killing ground, no fortress could truly survive. It began quietly, almost invisibly, deep in the heart of Germany's war machine, in the small, smoky workshops where engineers in gray coats drew blueprints no one outside would see for years. They weren't just making a new weapon, they were making a message. By late 1942, the German high command had a problem. The American bombers were coming, more of them every week, higher, heavier, more determined. The B-17s and their crews had become a wall of steel in the sky. Fighters with rifle-caliber guns simply couldn't stop them fast enough. You could pour hundreds of rounds into a fortress, and it would still limp home, smoking, but alive. So, the Luftwaffe's engineers asked the only question that mattered. What if one hit was enough? At Mauser and Rheinmetall, teams began experimenting with heavier calibers. First came the 20mm MG-151, already a beast compared to anything the Allies had. Its explosive shells could punch through armor and tear a bomber apart, but pilots complained they had to hit too many times. So the designers went further, creating something terrifying. The Mk-108, a 30mm autocannon that fired slower but hit like a thunderclap. Each round weighed almost half a kilo, the size of a small grenade. When it struck, it didn't just pierce metal. It detonated inside the aircraft, ripping apart structure, fuel, flesh, and bone. Pilots joked grimly that one shell could turn a B-17 into aluminum confetti. They weren't far off. The Mk-108 wasn't elegant. It wasn't even accurate at long range. But it didn't need to be. The Luftwaffe's new tactic was brutal simplicity. Close into 200 meters, fire a 1-second burst, and watched the fortress disintegrate. Now imagine being one of those bomber gunners, watching black dots racing toward you, faster than anything you'd ever seen. You see muzzle flashes, bright orange sparks. Then your world explodes in concussive thuds. A single shell can shred a wing spar, blast through the cockpit, or blow off the tail entirely. The German pilots knew the risk. To get that close, they had to fly straight into walls of 50 caliber fire. But some of them were veterans, aces with hundreds of missions behind them. They learned to strike from angles the Americans least expected. Frontal attacks, high-speed head-ons, diving out of the sun. One of them, Oberleutnant Heinz Knock, described it later. I could see their faces through the glass. The big bomber filled my sight. I fired a short burst, 2, maybe 3 shells, and the whole front of the aircraft erupted in orange flame. I had to pull up fast to avoid the wreckage. That was the nightmare now stalking every crew that flew into Germany. A weapon so powerful it erased the idea of safety. The B-17's armor could stop bullets, but it was useless against 30mm high explosive rounds. Even near misses were deadly. The shockwave alone could buckle wings or shatter control systems. Crews started finding new holes in their planes, not neat bullet holes, but jagged, fist-sized wounds that seemed to have torn the aluminum open. Back in England, intelligence officers began collecting fragments from damaged fortresses. What they found shocked them. Thick steel shards, twisted and scorched, stamped with German manufacturing codes. They realized they weren't facing the same old 20mm guns. This was something entirely new. The 8th Air Force had to adapt fast. They tried tighter formations, more escort fighters, heavier armor plates under the pilot's seat. None of it mattered much when a shell hit home. There were cases where entire crews vanished in an instant. No parachutes, no radio calls, just a flash of light and debris raining down. At first, bomber crews didn't even know what was killing them. They called it the Black Flash. Sometimes they'd hear a single dull whoomp, not the rattling burst of machine gun fire, just one sharp concussion, and the next moment, the bomber beside them was gone. The German engineers had achieved exactly what they wanted: efficiency through terror. To mount these new weapons, the Luftwaffe upgraded its fighters. The Messerschmitt Bf-109K, the FW-190A8, and later the twin-engine Me-410 bomber destroyer, all carried 30mm cannons in their noses. Some even experimented with 4-gun mounts, a single burst unleashing 2 kilos of explosive shells in less than a second. It was overkill, but in the brutal calculus of air war, overkill was perfect. For the first time, the Americans began to lose confidence in daylight bombing. The missions were still flown: Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Berlin. But the cost was climbing fast. 50, 60, sometimes 100 fortresses didn't come back. Thousands of young men vanished into the gray clouds over Europe, their names added to lists, their planes marked as missing. Yet even in the face of this new horror, the myth of the fortress endured. Newspapers back home couldn't print the full truth, not yet. They still called the B-17 invincible, still showed smiling crews beside their gleaming planes. But among the veterans, a darker name began to circulate: the curse of the flying fortress. Because the stronger they built it, the more brutal the weapons became to destroy it. And the 30mm cannon was only the beginning. The Germans were already testing something worse: heavier guns, rockets, and even jet fighters built for one purpose: to rip the fortresses apart before they reached their targets. But that moment, the first time those 30mm cannons met the bomber stream, that's where the legend turned into a nightmare. And in the next chapter, we'll go there, into the smoke and chaos of Schweinfurt, where entire formations vanished in daylight, and only a handful of men lived to tell what it was like when the sky itself seemed to explode around them. Dawn broke cold over England on October 14, 1943. The airfields of the 8th Air Force were shrouded in mist, the kind that soaked through wool jackets and turned breath into smoke. Mechanics worked under yellow lamps, tightening bolts, loading belts of 50 caliber rounds, filling bomb bays with the heavy steel cylinders marked "Made in the USA." The target for that day was one word whispered with dread: Schweinfurt. To the generals, it was just another name on a map, a city in Bavaria, home to the factories that made nearly every ball bearing in Germany. To the men who flew, it was a death sentence, written in neat block letters on the mission board. "Gentlemen," said the briefing officer, tapping his pointer on the red line that led deep into enemy territory, "you'll go in without fighter escort. Range is too far for the Mustangs and Thunderbolts. You're on your own from here to the target and back." A low murmur swept through the room. Everyone knew what that meant: hundreds of miles of hostile sky, and the Luftwaffe waiting. Still, no one said a word. They just scribbled notes, adjusted their flight caps, and walked out toward the planes. The engines started one by one, coughing smoke into the morning. Crews climbed aboard, 10 men to a ship: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and gunners. They called themselves crew, but by now they were more like family. They'd shared freezing air, fire, fear, and the endless drone of the cyclones for months. And today, some of them knew it might be the last time. Takeoff was routine. One after another, the fortresses lifted from the runways, climbing through the mist into pale sunlight. From the ground, it looked like a silver river flowing east. Inside the cockpits, frost crept across glass panels, and the thin air burned in their lungs. As they crossed the Dutch coast, the first flak greeted them, black bursts far below, lazy at first, then closer, sharper, brighter. It was the Luftwaffe's way of saying welcome back. But the real horror began over Germany. Fighters, 12 o'clock high. The cry echoed through the intercoms. The formation tightened instinctively. Tiny dots appeared ahead, dozens, then hundreds. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, sleek and fast, climbing in waves. They came head-on, guns flashing. The sky exploded. A fortress in the lead group vanished in a fireball. Another rolled onto its back, wings tearing away as men tumbled out, white parachutes bursting open like flowers against the smoke. One waist gunner later said it felt like standing in a hurricane made of metal. The Germans came in close, dangerously close, sometimes within 50 yards, and fired their new 30mm cannons. The shells didn't just hit, they detonated. One burst under a wing could snap a spar clean off. A direct hit to the nose turned the cockpit into dust. Tail gunners screamed into their headsets. "They're coming through the formation." You could see them, yellow-nosed FW-190s, diving straight through the bomber stream, spitting cannon fire, vanishing under the bellies of the fortresses. Some didn't pull up in time. They crashed into the bombers they were destroying, taking both down in burning spirals. For 20 minutes, the air was pure chaos. Flak bursts, tracers, exploding fuel tanks, engines on fire. Yet somehow, the remaining bombers kept flying. The crews were numb, working through muscle memory. Left engine out. Feather it. Keep her level. Navigators hit. Get a morphine shot in him. Radio's gone. Switch to emergency channel. When they reached Schweinfurt, the city was already burning from the first wave. The bombardiers took their positions, lined up the Norden sights, and released the payloads. From above, it looked calm, rows of black dots drifting downward, but each one carried a ton of destruction. The sky was filled with smoke and falling debris. Then came the turn for home. That's when the Luftwaffe struck again. Fresh squadrons of fighters rose to meet the retreating bombers. The formations were ragged now, holes where planes should have been, engines failing, wings full of holes. Some fortresses flew alone, easy prey. Pilots had to decide whether to slow down and protect stragglers or push ahead and survive. Most didn't have a choice. Damaged planes couldn't keep speed. A gunner from the 305th Group later recalled, "I saw one B-17 below us. The tail was gone, just gone. Two guys were still firing from the waist guns, like they didn't even notice half the airplane wasn't there anymore." By the time the surviving fortresses reached the channel, the attack finally eased. The sky was quiet again, except for the hum of crippled engines and the groans of wounded men. One by one, they limped home. Some landed on one wheel, some skidded onto the grass. Others never made it that far. They ditched into the cold North Sea, crews climbing into rafts, watching their planes sink beneath the waves. Of the 291 bombers that left England that morning, 60 never came back. More than 600 men were killed, captured, or missing. It was one of the costliest air battles of the war. The mission was called a strategic success. The factories were hit hard, but among the air crews, it had another name: Black Thursday. When the debriefings ended and the survivors stumbled back to their barracks, no one spoke. The smell of burnt oil and cordite still clung to their jackets. The medics carried stretchers past men sitting on the floor, staring at nothing. Later that night, the chaplain walked through the hangars, stepping around the empty spaces where planes used to be. The crews that survived were already writing letters, the kind that began with, "Mom, I'm okay," and ended with the names of friends who weren't. The myth of the invincible flying fortress died over Schweinfurt. But in its place came something harder, colder, the grim realization that survival itself was victory. And for those who made it back, the war wasn't over, because the Germans were already preparing a new nightmare: faster interceptors, heavier cannons, even rockets. The next time the fortresses came, the Luftwaffe would be waiting with weapons no one had ever seen before. The sky had turned into a battlefield of monsters, and the flying fortress was still right in the middle of it. Inside the B-17, the world was metal, vibration, and breath. Everything rattled. The guns, the floor panels, the headset wires. Even the air trembled from the 4 Cyclone engines, pushing the aircraft higher, higher into the thin blue, where the air froze and cracked against the skin of the plane. There was no comfort here, only noise and motion. The temperature outside could drop to 40 below, and inside, it wasn't much warmer. The oxygen masks crusted with frost from each exhaled breath. Leather gloves stiffened like boards. Sweat turned to ice before it could dry. The fortress looked massive from the ground, but once you were inside, it felt small, claustrophobic. 10 men, 10 stations, each separated by narrow metal ribs and cables that hummed like violin strings in the wind. You couldn't walk upright through most of it. You crawled, shuffled, climbed ladders, squeezed past the bomb bay. Every space had a purpose. Every inch was alive with tension. At the nose sat the bombardier, kneeling behind the glass bubble that caught the wind like a sail. His world was the target, the crosshairs of the Norden sight. To him, the rest of the crew were shadows and voices. He could see Germany before anyone else. Black forests, winding rivers, gray towns, and the flak that rose to meet them. He was also the most exposed man in the sky. There was nothing between him and the outside, but curved glass and air thin enough to suffocate. Behind him sat the navigator, bent over his maps, pencil dancing with the rhythm of the plane. He rarely looked up. His task was simple and absolute. Keep them on course. Even when the compass spun from magnetic bursts, even when clouds hid every landmark, he found the way. By instinct, by starlight, by the ticking clock on his wrist. The cockpit was the nerve center. 2 seats, side by side. The pilot's gloved hands tight on the yoke. The co-pilot scanning the instruments, calling out numbers over the engine roar. Fuel pressure, altitude, manifold heat. They barely talked now. They didn't need to. Every twitch of the other's hand spoke louder than words. Together, they held the fortress in the formation, never straying too far, never lagging behind. Behind them, the flight engineer crouched in the top turret, head and shoulders exposed through the glass dome. He was the eyes of the ship, the first to spot fighters diving from above. His twin 50s followed every flicker of movement, tracking shadows against the sun. Each time he fired, the recoil slammed through his chest like a heartbeat. Then came the radio operator, surrounded by cables and static. He was the fortress's voice, the one who reached out into the chaos and tried to make sense of it. Sometimes he'd catch fragments. Formation breaking. Engine 2 on fire. Voices that cut out mid-sentence. When the intercom went dead, he became the line between life and silence. The waist gunners stood at their open windows, one on each side. The wind tore through their jackets as they fired, tracer rounds streaking red against the clouds. They worked in rhythm, one firing, one reloading, shouting through hand signals because words were useless here. Brass casings rolled under their boots. The smell of cordite and oil filled their lungs. Farther back, in the cold tail, sat the loneliest man in the sky, the tail gunner. Cramped into a glass bubble no wider than a coffin, he watched the world disappear behind them. He saw every fighter that tried to sneak up from the rear. When they came, he fired until his hands bled from vibration. He had no one to talk to, no one to see, just the hum of engines and the scream of bullets that tore past his little window. Between them all hung the bomb bay, a thin catwalk above a black void. When the doors opened, the slipstream roared through like a hurricane. Men joked that if you slipped there, you wouldn't even have time to scream. Every mission was a ritual of fear disguised as discipline. The checklist, the climb, the formation, the flak. They said prayers under their breath, checked guns 3 times, touched Lucky Charms stitched to flight jackets. Some wore wedding rings over their gloves. Others carried snapshots pinned to the instrument panel. When the first shells burst, you didn't hear them. You felt them, like someone hitting the fuselage with a hammer. The plane shuddered, bolts rattled loose, frost fell like snow from the ceiling. Over the intercom came the calm voices of chaos. Flak, 2 o'clock. Waist gunner wounded. Feather engine 3. One tail gunner later described it simply. It was like sitting inside a drum while somebody beat on it with a hammer made of fire. Still, they kept firing. The fortress answered with flame. The gunners called their enemies by shapes. Bandit, 109, 190. Not by names. They never saw faces, just flashes, black crosses on wings, then smoke. Sometimes, when a fighter broke apart under fire, the gunners went quiet. Watching pieces fall through the clouds, they wondered who had been inside. It was war reduced to metal and motion. And then, there were the wounded. When a shell hit home, there was no warning, just a sound like thunder, and the sudden rush of air as the fuselage tore open. Medics didn't exist up there. The crew patched each other with bandages and morphine. They tied tourniquets with radio cables, prayed the oxygen held. If they survived the flak and the fighters, the silence on the way home was worse. No one spoke. The engines droned, the wounded moaned, the ice crackled on the windows. Sometimes they flew beside empty spaces where another fortress should have been. Landing was the hardest part. The ground crews ran to meet them, counting bullet holes, checking names. Some planes taxied in trailing smoke. Others came in on one wheel, collapsing as they stopped. And when the engines finally died, the men climbed out like ghosts, pale, trembling, covered in oil and blood, eyes too tired to cry. Inside the fortress, heroism wasn't a word. It was just survival, minute by minute, breath by frozen breath. But soon, survival itself would become nearly impossible, because the Luftwaffe was preparing its most lethal weapons yet, the jet fighters that could strike faster than anything the fortresses had ever faced. And the men inside those silver planes would soon learn that even steel has a breaking point.